The Bell Island boom. The wind howled across the desolate cliffs of Bell Island as our small research vessel approached the rocky shore. The island, normally peaceful in its isolation, had become the center of a mystery that no one could explain. A mystery that had drawn us from the safety of our university labs to this remote corner of Newfoundland. It all started with the explosion. April 2nd, 1978. That was the day everything changed for Bell Island. The boom had shattered the morning calm, sending shockwaves that rattled homes and knocked people off their feet. Windows shattered, birds scattered in every direction, and then silence. But it wasn't just any explosion. This one was different. The locals described it as a deafening roar, followed by a strange electromagnetic disturbance that knocked out power across the island and even affected nearby areas. Radios crackled with static. Compasses spun wildly, and for a few agonizing minutes, it was as if time itself had warped. No one could explain it. Not the local authorities, not the meteorologists, but we, the team of scientists sent to investigate, were determined to find the answer. At least that's what we thought when we first stepped foot on Bell Island. The island had an eerie stillness to it as we made our way toward the site of the explosion. A large crater that had been blasted into the earth. It was strange. There was no debris, no sign of a fire or any obvious source of the explosion. Just a gaping wound in the ground, as if something had been ripped from the earth itself. Dr. Ellis, the lead physicist, knelt by the edge of the crater, running his hands through the soil. No residue, he muttered. No chemical traces. This wasn't caused by any conventional explosive. I glanced around, unease settling in my stomach. The trees nearby were stripped of their leaves, their trunks blackened as if scorched by an invisible fire. The air felt heavy, charged with something unnatural. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, though no one else was around. Could it have been a meteor? Dr. Harper, our geologist, asked as she carefully inspected the rocks along the crater's edge. The impact force would explain the crater, but the electromagnetic disturbance... It wasn't a meteor, Dr. Ellis interrupted, his voice tense. There are no impact fragments, no radiation signatures. This is something else. We spent the rest of the day combing the area, taking samples and measurements, but nothing added up. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the crater, we set up camp a short distance away. No one spoke much over dinner. The strange energy in the air seemed to sap our strength, leaving us on edge, alert to every rustle of the wind. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in my tent, listening to the rhythmic crashing of the waves against the cliffs, but it did nothing to soothe my nerves. The more I thought about the explosion, the more uneasy I felt. What had caused it? Why were there no answers? And why did the crater feel so wrong? Then in the dead of night I heard it. A low humming noise, barely perceptible at first, but growing louder with each passing second. I sat up straining to hear, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound seemed to be coming from the crater. Slowly, I unzipped my tent and stepped out into the cold night air. The island was eerily quiet, too quiet. The wind had stopped, and the only sound was that strange hum, now vibrating through the ground beneath my feet. I glanced around. The other tents were still zipped up tight. No one else had noticed the noise. Curiosity, and something else, something I couldn't quite explain, drew me toward the crater. As I approached, the humming grew louder, more intense, and the ground seemed to pulse with each vibration. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to see what was causing it. When I reached the edge of the crater, I saw it. A faint glow deep within the earth. It was as if something was buried down there, something alive. My breath caught in my throat as I leaned closer, trying to make sense of the shifting light. And then, without warning, the ground beneath me gave way. I fell, tumbling down the steep side of the crater, dirt and rocks scraping against my skin as I slid helplessly toward the glowing center. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness surrounding me. I tried to grab onto something, anything to stop my descent, but it was no use. I was falling deeper and deeper into the earth. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the fall stopped. I found myself lying at the bottom of the crater, dazed and disoriented. The glow was gone. The humming had stopped. There was nothing but silence. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it. Something was down there with me. Something cold and ancient and hungry. I couldn't see it, but I could feel its presence, lurking just beyond the edge of the darkness. I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing, and backed away, my eyes darting around the pitch-black void. And then I heard it. A whisper, so faint I almost didn't catch it. A voice, not human, not anything I could recognize, but it was there, echoing in the back of my mind. Leave! I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and clawed my way back up the side of the crater, my hands shaking as I grasped at the loose dirt. The climb felt endless, but eventually I reached the top, gasping for breath. I collapsed on the ground, trembling as the cold night air bit at my skin. When I looked back down into the crater, the glow had returned, but this time it wasn't faint. It was bright, searing, and pulsing with an energy that made my skin crawl. Something was waking up down there. Something that should have been left undisturbed. I stumbled back to camp, too shaken to tell the others what I had seen. But as I lay in my tent, listening to the strange humming echo through the ground once more, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever had caused that explosion, it wasn't done with us yet. The next morning, I woke up drenched in sweat despite the cold. The events of the night before played over and over in my mind, but I couldn't bring myself to share what had happened with the others. How could I? I wasn't even sure if it was real or if my mind had betrayed me in the dark. But the fear lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. As we gathered around for breakfast, the mood was tense. Dr. Ellis was unusually quiet, staring into his coffee as if it held the answers he was so desperately searching for. Dr. Harper, on the other hand, seemed restless, her gaze constantly shifting toward the crater, as if she was drawn to it. Something was off with all of us, and I could feel the growing unease among the team. After a silent meal, we packed up our equipment and made our way back to the crater. The daylight offered no comfort. It only made the desolation more apparent. The charred trees, the barren earth, the unnatural silence. It was as if the island itself had been scarred by something far more sinister than just an explosion. As we began setting up more advanced instruments around the crater, Dr. Ellis knelt beside a strange pattern in the ground that none of us had noticed the day before. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but there, etched into the earth, a series of concentric circles. Too perfect to be natural. "What is this?" Dr. Harper asked, her voice trembling slightly as she knelt beside Ellis. "I don't know," he replied, tracing his fingers over the lines. "But it's not from the explosion. This was here before. Something or someone left this." A cold shiver ran down my spine as I watched them examine the pattern. The strange markings felt ancient, purposeful, like they were part of something far bigger than we could understand. I couldn't help but think back to the voice I had heard in the crater, the voice that had warned me to leave. As the day wore on, we continued our investigation, but something was different. The air felt heavier, thicker, as if the island was alive, watching us, waiting for something. Dr. Harper's equipment began to malfunction, her readings fluctuating wildly with no explanation. Compasses spun in circles, Geiger counters ticked without cause, and the strange electromagnetic hum seemed to pulse beneath our feet, growing louder with each passing hour. By mid-afternoon, Dr. Ellis had grown increasingly frustrated. "None of this makes sense," he muttered under his breath as he stared at the erratic data on his tablet. "We're not picking up anything that explains what happened here. It's like the island is fighting back." Suddenly, there was a loud crack, and one of our portable antennas snapped in half, falling to the ground with a thud. Everyone jumped, startled by the sudden noise. But it wasn't the broken equipment that had us frozen in place. It was the sound that followed. A deep, rumbling growl so low it seemed to vibrate through the earth, echoed from the crater. My heart stopped as I turned to face it, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. The glow was back, but this time, it wasn't just a faint light deep in the ground. It was spreading, pulsating up through the soil like veins of molten fire. The earth itself seemed to be cracking open, and from those cracks, that low growl reverberated, growing louder, more menacing. "What the hell is that?" Dr. Harper whispered, her voice barely audible over the rumble. None of us had an answer. We stood there, transfixed by the sight before us, too terrified to move. Then, without warning, the ground shook violently, throwing us off balance. The glow intensified, blinding us for a moment, and when I blinked the spots from my vision, I saw it. Something was rising from the crater. At first it looked like a shadow, an amorphous shifting form that seemed to have no substance. But as it grew, towering above the edge of the crater, it began to take shape. A figure vaguely human but twisted, distorted, its limbs elongated and its face a grotesque mask of emptiness. And from within that hollow face, two pinpricks of light burned with an intensity that sent waves of terror crashing over me. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything that belonged in our world. And it was awake. The creature let out a bone-chilling screech, and the ground beneath us trembled once more. I saw Dr. Harper stumble backward, her face pale with fear, while Dr. Ellis stood frozen, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and horror. "We need to leave!" I shouted, breaking the spell of paralysis that had gripped us. "Now!" But just as we began to scramble away, the creature moved. With a speed that seemed impossible for something so large, it lunged forward, reaching out with one of its twisted limbs. There was a sickening crunch as it grabbed hold of Dr. Ellis, lifting him into the air like a rag doll. His scream echoed across the island, a sound of pure primal terror that I knew I would never forget. I wanted to run, to do something, but my legs refused to move. All I could do was watch as the creature held Dr. Ellis in its grasp, its burning eyes locked onto his, and then with a violent snap, it crushed him. Blood sprayed across the ground and his body fell limp, lifeless to the earth. Dr. Harper screamed, and that finally broke my paralysis. I grabbed her arm and pulled her with me, running as fast as I could toward the shore. Behind us, the creature let out another screech and the ground shook again, but I didn't dare look back. All I could think about was getting off that island, getting as far away from that thing as possible. We reached the boat, breathless and shaking, and I fumbled with the engine, my hands slick with sweat and trembling with fear. Dr. Harper kept looking over her shoulder, her eyes wide with panic. But the creature didn't follow. It stayed by the crater, watching us, its burning eyes glowing in the distance. As the boat finally roared to life, I cast one last glance back at the island. The creature was gone, but the glow remained, pulsating beneath the earth, a reminder that something far more dangerous than we could ever imagine had been unleashed. And as we sped away from Bell Island, the humming returned. It was faint, barely noticeable over the sound of the engine, but it was there, vibrating through the air. It followed us, growing louder, and I realized with a sinking feeling in my chest that we hadn't escaped. The nightmare had only just begun. We didn't speak for the entire boat ride back to the mainland. The hum that had followed us from the island reverberated in my head, growing louder with each passing mile. The world around us seemed muted, distant, as if we were trapped in some kind of waking nightmare. I could still see Dr. Ellis in my mind, his lifeless body crumpling to the ground, his scream echoing in my ears. By the time we reached the docks, night had fallen. The small fishing village was quiet, the usual sounds of life dampened by a creeping sense of unease. We disembarked, our steps heavy, our minds clouded by fear and confusion. Dr. Harper and I hadn't exchanged a word since we left the island, and I wasn't sure if we even could. What could we possibly say? As we walked toward the small inn where we were staying, I felt eyes on me. The locals, who had once greeted us with curiosity and warmth, now watched us from the shadows of their homes, their expressions unreadable. They knew. They had to know something was wrong. Maybe they had felt it too. That shift in the air, that unnatural presence that had gripped the island. We reached the inn and I immediately locked the door behind us. Dr. Harper collapsed onto the bed, her face pale and drawn, her hands still trembling. She looked like a ghost, hollowed out by the horrors we had witnessed. I wanted to comfort her, to say something that would make it all go away, but there were no words, only silence. I can't believe he's gone, she whispered, her voice barely audible. What was that thing? I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that it wasn't supposed to be there. Whatever we had awakened on Bell Island, it was far beyond our understanding, beyond anything that should exist in our world. We need to contact someone, I said, forcing myself to speak. The military, the government, anyone who can stop this. We can't just leave it there. But even as I said the words, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. Who would believe us? Who would believe that we had encountered something beyond explanation? A force that had killed one of our own and was still lurking on that island, waiting for something. Dr. Harper shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. What if it follows us? What if it finds us? I didn't have an answer for that either. The hum, still faint but ever present, seemed to agree with her. It was like a constant reminder that we hadn't left the island behind, that whatever was there was still connected to us, still watching. We spent the night in a restless silence, neither of us able to sleep. The minutes dragged on like hours, and every little sound outside the window sent a jolt of fear through me. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that the thing from the crater had somehow reached across the water and was here with us, waiting for the right moment to strike. When morning finally came, we were exhausted, but there was no time to rest. We needed answers. We needed to understand what had happened on Bell Island before it was too late. The town library was our first stop, a small, dusty building that looked like it hadn't seen much use in decades. The librarian, an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a thin smile, greeted us with a knowing look. She didn't ask why we were there. She didn't need to. It was as if she knew what we were looking for. As we scoured the shelves for any information on the island, strange phenomena, or unexplained events, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something, some crucial piece of the puzzle that would make everything click into place. But all we found were old legends, stories passed down through generations of islanders, tales of dark forces that had once roamed the land. And then, in a dusty old book tucked away in the farthest corner of the library, I found it. A mention of Bell Island, dated back to the early 1900s. The passage was brief, barely more than a footnote, but it chilled me to the bone. Beware the island of forgotten souls. The earth there is cursed, and the darkness within it stirs when disturbed. Many have tried to uncover its secrets, and all have paid the price. Asterisk, asterisk. It wasn't much, but it confirmed what I had feared. Bell Island was more than just a place. It was a trap, a prison for something ancient and malevolent, and we had set it free. As I showed the passage to Dr. Harper, her face grew even paler. "We need to tell someone," she whispered, her voice shaking. "We need to get help. We can't handle this on our own." But before I could respond, the lights in the library flickered. The hum, the one that had followed us from the island, grew louder, vibrating through the floorboards. The librarian looked up, her sharp eyes narrowing, and for the first time, I saw fear in them. "Get out," she said in a low, urgent voice. "Get out now!" But it was too late. The ground shook violently, and the bookshelves rattled as if something immense and unseen was moving beneath us. The hum became a deafening roar, and the lights flickered wildly before plunging the room into darkness. And then, from the far end of the library, came a sound that made my blood run cold. The unmistakable scrape of something dragging itself across the floor. I grabbed Dr. Harper's arm and pulled her toward the door, my heart racing. But as we turned to flee, the sound followed us, closer, faster. I could feel it behind us, that same cold, malevolent presence from the crater, now somehow here in the mainland, stalking us through the darkened library. We burst through the door and out into the daylight, gasping for breath. But the terror didn't fade. The hum was still there, vibrating in the air around us. And I knew that we couldn't run from it. We had unleashed something terrible, something that wasn't bound by distance or time. And now it was coming for us. As we stood there, trembling in the cold morning air, I realized with a sickening dread that we had made a fatal mistake. Bell Island wasn't just cursed. It was a doorway, and we had opened it. The library doors slammed shut behind us, and for a moment the world seemed to stand still. Dr. Harper clutched my arm, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her eyes wide with terror. The hum that had haunted us from Bell Island was now deafening, vibrating through the very air around us, a constant, insidious presence that we couldn't escape. "We need to go," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise. "We need to leave this place, now!" But where could we go? The thing that we had unleashed on Bell Island was here, with us. It had followed us across the water, through the town, and now it was closing in. Running wouldn't save us. We had to face it. A cold, biting wind whipped through the village as we made our way to the docks. The locals were nowhere to be seen, their homes locked and shuttered. It was as if the entire town had sensed the darkness we had brought with us, and had retreated into hiding, leaving us to fend for ourselves. When we reached the boat, I hesitated. Going back to Bell Island seemed like a death sentence. But I knew we had no choice. Whatever this thing was, it was connected to the island. If we wanted to stop it, we had to go back. We had to finish what we had started. Dr. Harper didn't protest. She climbed into the boat, her face pale and expressionless, as if she had already resigned herself to whatever fate awaited us. As we sped away from the mainland, the hum grew louder, reverberating through the water, the sky, even through our very bones. It was everywhere, surrounding us, suffocating us. The island loomed on the horizon, dark and foreboding, a jagged silhouette against the stormy sky. The moment we set foot on its shores, the hum stopped. The silence that followed was so sudden, so complete, that it made my ears ring. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to hope that maybe, just maybe, it was over. But that hope quickly evaporated when I saw the glow. It was brighter now, pulsating from the crater like a beacon, drawing us toward it. "We have to go back there," Dr. Harper said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We have to find a way to stop it." I nodded, though I had no idea how we were supposed to do that. But we had come this far. We couldn't turn back now. As we approached the crater, the glow intensified, bathing the charred earth in an eerie, unnatural light. The markings we had seen before were more pronounced now, the concentric circles glowing with the same sickly light that emanated from the crater. It was as if the very ground was alive, pulsating with a dark energy that I couldn't begin to comprehend. And then, from the depths of the crater, the creature emerged. It was even larger than before, its grotesque form shifting and writhing as it rose from the earth. Its eyes, those burning pinpricks of light, locked onto us, and I felt a wave of cold, paralyzing terror wash over me. This thing wasn't just a creature. It was a force. Something ancient and malevolent that had been buried deep beneath the island for centuries, waiting for someone, waiting for us, to set it free. Dr. Harper stumbled back, her eyes wide with horror. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "How do we stop it?" But before I could answer, the ground beneath us began to shake. The glow from the crater intensified, and the creature let out a bone-chilling screech that echoed across the island. The concentric circles in the ground began to pulse with light, and I realized with a sickening dread what was happening. The island was a gateway, and we had opened it. The creature wasn't alone. It was just the first of many. Suddenly, the air around us grew cold, freezing like the depths of winter. I could see my breath in the air, and the ground beneath my feet was covered in a thin layer of frost. The wind howled around us, and for a brief moment I thought I heard voices. Whispers carried on the wind, growing louder, more insistent. They were coming, and we couldn't stop them. I grabbed Dr. Harper's arm and pulled her back toward the boat, but the ground beneath us was crumbling, the very earth splitting open as more of the creatures began to emerge. Their forms were twisted, unnatural, their glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. As we stumbled down the path, I heard a sound behind me, the low rumbling growl of something massive. I turned just in time to see the largest of the creatures towering above us, its grotesque face contorted in a hideous, twisted grin. And then before I could react, it lunged. There was a sharp, blinding pain in my chest, and I looked down to see the creature's twisted limb impaled through my body. I gasped, the air leaving my lungs in a wheezing, desperate breath. My vision blurred, and I could feel the cold spreading through me, freezing me from the inside out. But in that moment, just before everything went dark, I saw it. The truth. The reason why we had been drawn to the island in the first place. The reason why the explosion had happened. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a natural phenomenon. It was a test. A test conducted by something far beyond human comprehension. Something that had been watching us, manipulating us from the very beginning. We were never meant to survive. We were never meant to leave the island. We were just the first, and now it was their turn. As the darkness closed in around me, I heard the creatures whisper in my mind. Cold, insidious, and final. Welcome to the end. And then there was nothing.